The most wanted war criminal in Asia stood in his palace waiting to be arrested, tried, and hanged for crimes that had killed millions across the Pacific. Emperor Hirohito of Japan had presided over atrocities from Nanking to Bataan. His military had conducted medical experiments on prisoners. His forces had starved and tortured Allied POWs, and the world wanted justice delivered at the end of a rope. Joseph Stalin demanded his execution. The Australian government demanded his execution. MacArthur's own staff officers called him a war criminal who deserved Nuremberg-style prosecution. And then, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Japan, made a decision that his own generals called treason. He would protect Hirohito from prosecution, shield him from war crimes trials, and use the emperor's authority to rebuild Japan into a democratic ally. The gamble could have destroyed MacArthur's career, sparked rebellion across occupied Japan, and created a diplomatic crisis that fractured the Allied coalition. Instead, it prevented a guerrilla war that would have killed millions and transformed America's most hated enemy into its strongest Pacific ally. Before we dive into why MacArthur defied the entire Allied command structure to save Japan's emperor, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're covering the decisions that rewrote history by breaking every rule. Let's get back to August 1945, when victory created an impossible question about whether punishing war criminals mattered more than preventing the next war. The case against Hirohito was overwhelming and backed by evidence that made the Nazi leadership look restrained by comparison. The rape of Nanking in 1937 had killed between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians in 6 weeks of systematic murder, rape, and torture conducted by Japanese forces operating under the emperor's authority. The Bataan Death March in 1942 killed approximately 10,000 American and Filipino prisoners who were starved, beaten, and executed during a forced march that violated every principle of the Geneva Conventions. Japanese medical units conducted biological warfare experiments on prisoners in Manchuria, infecting captives with plague and anthrax to study disease progression. Japanese forces across Asia had committed atrocities so routine that Allied intelligence had documented thousands of separate incidents. The legal argument for prosecuting Hirohito was straightforward and politically popular. He was the constitutional head of state and supreme commander of Japanese military forces. Orders were issued in his name, military planning occurred with his knowledge, and Japan's military culture treated the emperor as a living god whose authority was absolute. International law held that heads of state could be prosecuted for war crimes committed under their authority. The precedent established at Nuremberg was being applied to Nazi leadership, and there was no logical reason to exempt Hirohito when Hitler would have faced trial if he'd survived. Public opinion in Allied nations overwhelmingly supported prosecution. Polls showed over 70% of Americans wanted Hirohito tried as a war criminal, and political pressure on the Truman administration to seek justice was intense. MacArthur arrived in Japan on August 30, 1945, and immediately began receiving demands from Allied governments about the emperor's fate. Stalin sent messages through diplomatic channels insisting that Hirohito must face trial and execution like other Axis leaders. The Australian government, whose forces had suffered enormously fighting Japan, formally requested that Hirohito be prosecuted for war crimes against Australian POWs. The Chinese government, representing millions of civilians killed by Japanese forces, demanded justice that could only be satisfied by the emperor's death. MacArthur's own staff officers, men who'd fought across the Pacific and watched friends die in Japanese prison camps, believed Hirohito deserved prosecution and couldn't understand why their commander was hesitating. MacArthur's counterargument was based on cold strategic calculation rather than mercy or forgiveness. He'd studied Japanese culture and political structure, consulted with experts on Japanese society, and reached a conclusion that horrified idealists but made tactical sense. Prosecuting Hirohito would trigger armed resistance across Japan that would make the invasion casualties look modest by comparison. The Japanese military had been preparing for a last-stand defense of the home islands, with plans calling for civilian participation in guerrilla warfare that would turn every city into a battlefield. Japan's surrender had been presented to the population as the emperor's decision to end the war and protect his people, and removing Hirohito would destroy the narrative that had convinced Japanese forces to lay down weapons. The numbers supported MacArthur's assessment in ways that made prosecution look strategically insane. Japan in August 1945 still had approximately 2.3 million soldiers under arms on the home islands. Millions of civilians had been trained in bamboo spear tactics for defending against invasion, and emperor worship was so deeply embedded in Japanese culture that removing him would be perceived as an attack on Japan itself, rather than justice against a war criminal. MacArthur's intelligence staff estimated that prosecuting Hirohito would require maintaining an occupation force of over 1 million Allied troops for decades to suppress resistance, cost tens of thousands of American casualties suppressing insurgency, and potentially kill millions of Japanese in fighting that would devastate the country America was trying to rebuild. The strategic argument went beyond just preventing guerrilla war. It extended to the emerging Cold War reality that was already reshaping Allied priorities. Soviet forces had occupied Manchuria and northern Korea during Japan's collapse. Stalin was positioning the USSR to dominate East Asia, and American planners recognized a stable, democratic Japan was essential for containing Soviet expansion in the Pacific. A Japan consumed by insurgency and chaos would create a power vacuum that Stalin would exploit, but a Japan rebuilt under American guidance with the emperor's cooperation could become a bulwark against communism. MacArthur made his decision in September 1945 and presented it to Washington as a fait accompli rather than a request for permission. He would retain Hirohito as emperor, but strip him of political power, transform the monarchy into a ceremonial institution, and use the emperor's authority to re-legitimize democratic reforms that would restructure Japanese society. The emperor would publicly renounce his divinity, accept responsibility for the war without facing criminal prosecution, and cooperate with occupation authorities in rebuilding Japan. MacArthur framed this as the only approach that would prevent catastrophic resistance while achieving American strategic objectives. The reaction from Allied governments was immediate fury and accusations that MacArthur was protecting a war criminal for political convenience. The Soviet Union formally protested, arguing that different standards were being applied to German and Japanese leaders, and that MacArthur was demonstrating American imperialism by unilaterally deciding the emperor's fate. Australia's government sent diplomatic protests demanding that their war dead deserved justice that only Hirohito's prosecution could provide. Chinese representatives pointed out that MacArthur was prioritizing American strategic interests over justice for Asian victims who'd suffered the worst of Japanese atrocities. MacArthur's response to these protests was characteristically blunt. He was supreme commander of occupied Japan. The decision was his to make, and anyone who disagreed could try replacing him and dealing with the consequences. The domestic political crisis was equally intense as American veterans groups and public opinion turned against what looked like protecting the enemy. Veterans who'd survived Japanese prison camps testified before Congress, describing atrocities committed in the emperor's name and demanding to know why Hirohito wasn't facing trial.
Newspaper editorials questioned whether MacArthur had gone rogue, whether civilian control of the military meant anything if generals could ignore political pressure, and whether protecting Hirohito made the United States complicit in war crimes by shielding the man responsible. Congressional hearings examined MacArthur's decision with hostile questioning about whether strategic concerns justified abandoning principles of justice. MacArthur's defense was that principles required strategic implementation and that moral satisfaction wasn't worth millions of lives. He testified that prosecuting Hirohito would require the United States to fight a second war against Japan, this time a guerrilla conflict with no clear endpoint, and that American mothers who'd already sacrificed sons in the Pacific War deserved leaders who prevented the next war rather than pursuing symbolic justice. The argument was cold, calculating, and politically tone-deaf, but it was also strategically sound in ways that became clear as occupation proceeded. Hirohito's first meeting with MacArthur on September 27, 1945, demonstrated the gamble's initial payoff. The emperor arrived expecting arrest and possible execution, but MacArthur received him as a partner in rebuilding Japan rather than a prisoner awaiting trial. The photographs from that meeting, showing MacArthur in casual uniform standing beside the formally dressed emperor, shocked both Japanese and American audiences because they showed the conqueror treating the conquered leader with respect rather than contempt. MacArthur's calculation was that this respect would translate into cooperation that orders and threats couldn't achieve. The cooperation materialized in January 1946 when Hirohito issued the Humanity Declaration, a radio address where he renounced his divinity and redefined the emperor's role as symbolic rather than political. The declaration was written by American occupation authorities, but delivered in Hirohito's voice, and it provided the framework for transforming Japan's government from imperial autocracy to constitutional democracy. MacArthur used the emperor's authority to legitimize reforms that Japanese conservatives would have violently opposed if imposed solely by foreign occupiers, land reform that broke up feudal estates, education reform that eliminated militarist indoctrination, and constitutional reform that established democratic governance. The strategic results of MacArthur's decision became measurable within 2 years as Japan stabilized without the predicted insurgency. Japanese forces demobilized peacefully because the emperor ordered it. Civilian cooperation with occupation authorities was substantial because Hirohito endorsed it, and democratic reforms took root because they were presented as the emperor's wishes rather than American demands. The cost of occupation in American lives was minimal, dozens rather than the thousands MacArthur's staff had predicted if Hirohito faced prosecution. And Japan began the economic recovery that would transform it into a major American ally within a decade. But the moral cost of MacArthur's decision remained controversial because protecting Hirohito meant justice denied for millions of victims. The Chinese government never forgave the decision, viewing it as proof that American strategic interests outweighed Asian lives, and the decision complicated post-war relations between Japan and its neighbors for decades. Korean victims of Japanese occupation, Filipino survivors of Japanese atrocities, and prisoners of war who'd been tortured in Japanese camps all watched the man they held responsible walk free, while lower-ranking officers faced prosecution at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The inconsistency was glaring and indefensible from a pure justice perspective. MacArthur's defenders argued that leadership required choosing between imperfect options where moral purity wasn't available. Prosecuting Hirohito satisfied justice but guaranteed war. Protecting him enabled peace but compromised accountability. And MacArthur chose the option that saved lives rather than satisfied revenge. Critics argued that this established a precedent where powerful war criminals could escape justice by being strategically useful, that it sent a message that some atrocities were forgivable if prosecuting them was inconvenient, and that American credibility on human rights was permanently damaged by protecting someone who should have faced trial. The long-term vindication of MacArthur's gamble came through Japan's transformation into a democratic democracy and American ally, but vindication didn't erase the moral compromise. By 1952, when the occupation ended, Japan had a democratic constitution, a pacifist military limited to self-defense, and an economy beginning the growth that would make it the world's second largest by the 1980s. The alliance between the United States and Japan became a cornerstone of American Pacific strategy. Japanese bases hosted American forces that contained Soviet and later Chinese expansion, and the partnership that began with MacArthur protecting Hirohito proved strategically invaluable throughout the Cold War. Hirohito remained emperor until his death in 1989, a 63-year reign that saw Japan transform from militarist empire to peaceful democracy. He never faced prosecution, never served time for crimes committed under his authority, and lived comfortably while victims of Japanese aggression struggled with trauma and loss. The injustice was real and permanent, but so was the peace that MacArthur's decision enabled. Whether the trade-off was justified depends on whether you believe preventing future deaths outweighs punishing past crimes. MacArthur himself never expressed doubt about the decision, viewing it as the choice that prevented millions of casualties and created the conditions for Japan's democratic transformation. His critics, including some of his own staff officers, believed he'd sacrificed justice for expediency and that principles shouldn't bend to strategic convenience, regardless of cost. The debate continued long after both men were dead, with historians arguing about whether MacArthur was a pragmatic genius who prevented catastrophic war or a moral coward who protected Hirohito because prosecution was difficult. The long-term lesson from MacArthur's decision is about the impossible choices that follow victory when punishing enemies conflicts with preventing the next war. Nuremberg prosecutions of Nazi leaders established that heads of state could face justice for crimes committed under their authority, but Hirohito's immunity demonstrated that justice was negotiable when strategic interests demanded it. The inconsistency damaged American credibility and created precedents that authoritarian leaders have cited ever since when avoiding accountability. What's undeniable is that MacArthur gambled his career and reputation on a decision that violated Allied expectations, domestic political pressure, and moral arguments for accountability. The gamble worked in the narrow sense that Japan didn't descend into insurgency and became a stable democracy, but it failed in the broader sense that victims never received justice, and the man responsible for millions of deaths died peacefully in his palace. Whether MacArthur made the right choice or simply made the expedient choice remains one of the most contentious questions about post-war justice and the relationship between morality and strategy. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're covering the decisions where doing the right thing and doing the strategic thing weren't the same thing, and leaders had to choose knowing they'd be condemned regardless. Drop a comment telling us whether MacArthur was right to protect Hirohito or whether war criminals should face justice regardless of strategic consequences, because that question about when justice matters less than peace defines how we think about victory and what we're willing to sacrifice to prevent the next war.